The easy questions first. There's huge questions, and they're where are we is in a way easier to answer than how did we get here? Because that requires looking at historical issues and developments. And based on the last 18 years, most of which I've spent in America, nearly 19 years, and hundreds of conversations with hundreds, if not more, Americans, thousands of Americans, and a vast range of experiences, where we are is in a mess. And finally, America generally is finally coming out of denial enough, and Americans are coming out of denial enough about that to acknowledge it. What the mess is and how to fix the mess, the way it's being perceived and defined is part of the mess. Because part of the mess is that everyone's blaming everyone else. That's what got us into the mess. Everyone's saying, I'm right and you're wrong. There's massive, endless layers and layers and layers of self-righteousness. And that's part of what got us into the mess. Now, how we got into that, basically, well, do we start with the Civil War? Which in the South, by the way, is referred to as the War of Northern Aggression. And having spent quite a bit of time in the South, I can say very easily that many Southerners talk about the War of Northern Aggression as if it was last year. It is that real for them. There is still that much resentment about it. There's still talk by governors and senior officials and politicians in several southern states about seceding from the Union. In other words, doing what was attempted, 150 something years ago, yeah? So do we start with the Civil War and its causes, or do we go back to the revolution against England and what that was really about, which wasn't about freedom, it was about the greatest tax avoidance scheme in the world, in history. The richest people in America got fed up with paying taxes to England.
Well, let's start there then, because that seems to be
It is.
fundamentally linked with what the kind of economic crisis we face now.
Well, which economic crisis do we face
Well, I
now?
mean, at least
Hang on. I don't want to. I mean, we're sitting here and it's mid-July, 2011, and yes, there's an economic crisis. What's been called an economic crisis, where the debt ceiling has to be raised in 2 weeks, or the country goes bankrupt and defaults on its loans. But that's just this crisis. There's been financial crises going on that I remember back to the 80s with the S&L crisis, where George W. Bush's brother was involved and scammed God knows how many millions of dollars. They were practicing back then to rip off the American people. And what happened in the last couple of years under Bush's brother was the biggest rip-off in the history of the world, the biggest act of theft and piracy in the history of the world. But that's what America does. Now it's doing it to itself. Now, I know that presses Americans' buttons. And I'll say it again, I've been living in America most of the last 18 years. My son's an American citizen. I'm planning to become an American citizen. I'm not attacking Americans or even America. What I'm saying is it's time to get real with what's going on. And part of the problem in America, with America and Americans, is that they live in a state of denial. When I was 20 years old and started learning psychiatry, my first mentor was a wonderful psychiatrist named Ray Atkinson, who did a lecture on the psychiatric conditions of different countries around the world. And I distinctly remember that he quickly identified America as schizophrenic. And he did so because America has the qualities of certain kinds of schizophrenia, specifically denial and projection. It's not me, it's you. It's not about me, it's about you. I'm perfect, you're wrong. So that shows up in every area of American life, yeah? At the personal level, the community level, national level, and international level. And as we do more of these talks and interviews, we'll get into in much more depth the American psyche and how America actually functions. Because sadly, and again through hundreds if not thousands of conversations and many media appearances in America and writing articles and newspapers and whatever, I've interacted with Americans from young teenage black armed gangbangers through to extraordinarily, unbelievably wealthy business people in places like Aspen and Telluride and so on. And across the board, the level of ignorance about America and America's history and America's place in the world is astonishing. Astonishing. And when you look at the statistics, 50% of Americans today are functionally illiterate. 50% of Americans cannot locate America on a world map. Think about that. 50% of Americans don't vote. They couldn't be bothered voting. Yeah. I mean, the statistics go on and on. It's really pretty terrible. The state of the union, which is not a union at all, it's in constant disunion, is pretty sad. It's a mess. And as I say, Americans more and more. So I came to America in '92, and since then, I mean, I looked around and went, wow, you guys are in trouble. And everyone went, what do you mean? I said, I see people with 15 maxed out credit cards thinking they're never going to have to pay them off. Yeah, for example, I started identifying America as the new Roman Empire back in 1994, and I had friends who were editors and journalists looked at me like I was insane. Now it's commonly accepted that America is an empire, and it's a military-based and economic-based empire in the world, and it brings with it the problems as well as the payoffs of being an empire, and we'll look at that in more depth. So back to the beginning, basically the Brits, the British king, taxed its colony, America. And the colonists got to a point where they were independently wealthy and they didn't want to pay taxes. And so all the founding fathers, all this talk about freedom and that was nice. It was part of it. They wanted their freedom, but that was not the motivating factor. The motivating factor was that they didn't want to pay taxes. The basis of the revolution against the British was that they didn't want to pay taxes, as we know from the Boston Tea Party. And of course that's come down in a perverse form now where Americans think they should get a free lunch and they don't want to pay for it. They don't want to pay taxes. Any politician who says I'm going to raise taxes might as well just hang himself in public because he hasn't got a chance in hell of getting elected. Yeah? Any politician who raises taxes is fighting for his political life. Americans hate taxation. And there's this bizarre, distorted historical strand back to the Boston Tea Party about that somehow taxes are wrong or taxes are buckling under. And it shows up in the incredible narcissism of Americans and that sense of incredible privilege that comes with being a powerful empire that says, we should get it for free. We're entitled, yeah? And of course, white Americans, the American culture has that, the American country has that, and white Americans, and especially middle class and upper class and wealthy, not that America has classes, of course, oh no. Yeah, right. Have economic classes, not class by birth, class by wallet. The upper classes and the wealthier white people absolutely live in a sense of privilege to a degree that I, as an alien, a foreigner, an Australian, find appalling. And started identifying again back in early 90s that was going to be the source of the downfall of America. It was the hubris, the arrogance, and the sense of privilege that there was no accountability, no responsibility. You should just be delivered everything on a plate, preferably by black servants.
And how dangerous to have that in combination with the denial
Oh,
of
and astonishing. And a denial of how that privilege came about. And basically that privilege came about and continues to come about by controlling and looting the rest of the world.